The sound was distinct. A wet, hollow pop, like a dry branch snapping underfoot. But this wasn't wood breaking. It was the sound of a steel spike punching through the thin layer of bone behind a human eye. The procedure required no operating theater, no sterile scalpels, and often, no anesthesia. It relied on a common carpenter's hammer and a 6-inch orbitoclast. Once the instrument breached the skull, the doctor would simply sweep it back and forth, turning the frontal lobes, the seat of our personality, our dreams, and our fears, into a chaotic slurry. For 2 decades, this wasn't considered assault. It was considered a miracle. One man, driving a camper van he affectionately called the Lobotomobile, traveled across the American highways. Like a twisted evangelist, he left behind a wake of nearly 3,500 patients who were not cured, but silenced. He wasn't a monster hiding in the dark. He was a celebrity, standing in the spotlight. This is the file on Dr. Walter Freeman, and the dark truth hidden beneath. To understand how a man with a carpenter's pick became a medical hero, we must first step inside the American asylum system of the 1930s and 40s. It was a landscape of absolute despair. State hospitals were overflowing, underfunded, and filthy. They were warehouses for the unwanted, often nicknamed snake pits, where patients were stripped of their dignity, chained to radiators, or left to rot in their own waste. In an era before effective antipsychotic drugs like Thorazine, there was no cure. There was only containment. The medical community was desperate for a solution, any solution, that could empty these overcrowded wards and reduce the financial burden on the state. Enter Dr. Walter Freeman. He was a man of impeccable pedigree, the grandson of a famous surgeon, and the chair of neurology at George Washington University. But he possessed a dangerous combination of traits: brilliant intellect, theatrical ambition, and a complete lack of surgical certification. Freeman wasn't a surgeon. He was a neurologist, yet he looked at the suffering in the asylums and saw a path to immortality. He became obsessed with the work of Egas Moniz, a Portuguese doctor who drilled holes in the skull to cut brain tissue. But Freeman found the procedure too slow, too delicate, and too exclusive. He wanted a technique for the masses. He theorized that mental illness was caused by overactive emotions, circling the brain's frontal lobes, like a trapped animal. His solution was visceral in its simplicity. Sever the connection. Cut the wire. He didn't need a sterile operating room, scrub nurses, or expensive anesthesia machinery. He wanted a procedure that could be done in a doctor's office during a lunch break. This was the birth of the transorbital lobotomy. It wasn't presented merely as a last resort for the violently insane. It was marketed as a quick fix for the melancholy, the anxious, and the rebellious. Families, exhausted by the stigma and strain of caring for mentally ill relatives, weren't told about the vegetative states or the loss of self. They were sold a fresh start. They signed the consent forms, believing they were saving their loved ones, unaware they were simply turning down the volume of their humanity. Until it was silent. By 1946, Dr. Walter Freeman had evolved from a neurologist into a traveling evangelist. He purchased a camper van, affectionately christened the Lobotomobile, and embarked on a macabre road trip across the United States. He wasn't visiting prestigious medical centers. He was hunting in the backwoods. He stopped at state hospitals and private sanitariums, performing demonstrations with the casual flair of a vacuum cleaner salesman. Freeman was a showman who craved the gaze of the camera. He often operated without a mask or gloves, sometimes with a cigarette dangling from his lips as the hammer fell. In a display of terrifying arrogance, he once lobotomized 2 patients simultaneously, one with his left hand, one with his right, just to prove to the gathered press that he could. He wanted an audience for his miracles, but behind the applause, the human cost was accumulating in silence. The most high-profile tragedy occurred not in a forgotten asylum, but within the American political aristocracy. Rosemary Kennedy was the eldest daughter of the Kennedy dynasty. She was a vibrant, eager-to-please young woman, but she struggled with mild intellectual disabilities and mood swings that her father, Joseph Kennedy, viewed as a liability to the family's political ambitions. He didn't seek a cure. He sought control. Without consulting his wife or daughter, Joseph summoned Freeman. At 23, Rosemary was strapped to a table, fully awake. Freeman instructed her to recite the Lord's Prayer and sing "God Bless America" as he cut into her brain. He continued to slice until the singing stopped. The result was catastrophic. Rosemary was instantly reduced to an infantile state, unable to walk or speak intelligibly. She was hidden away in an institution for the rest of her life, a living secret, buried by ambition. If Rosemary represented the elite, Howard Dully represented the defenseless. In 1960, Howard was just 12 years old. He wasn't schizophrenic. He wasn't hallucinating. He was simply a defiant preteen who clashed with his stepmother. She portrayed his natural rebellion as a severe mental defect, describing him as uncontrollable. Freeman didn't interview the boy's teachers. He didn't observe Howard in a neutral setting. He simply took the stepmother's word and checked the boxes. On a cold December morning, Howard was taken to a hospital in San Jose under the pretense of a checkup. Instead, he was sedated, electroshocked into unconsciousness, and lobotomized. Freeman inserted the orbitoclast into the tear duct of a sleeping child and hammered it home. Howard woke up with 2 black eyes and a brain that felt like it was filled with glass. He spent decades drifting through a mental fog, unaware of what had been stolen from him, until years later. But Howard was one of the lucky ones. He survived with his memory intact. For thousands of others, the cure was a descent into a living purgatory. Freeman claimed a success rate of 85%, but his definition of success was terrifyingly low. Success didn't mean the patient was happy, functional, or restored. It meant they were quiet. He turned vibrant, complex human beings into docile pets. This was the phenomenon of the surgically induced childhood. Patients returned home unable to feed themselves, wetting the bed, or staring at a wall for hours, entranced by a floating dust mote. Husbands who had signed consent forms to cure their wives' depression found themselves living with strangers who smiled constantly but felt nothing. They were ghosts, haunting their own homes. Freeman called this adjustment. He explicitly advised families that they might have to treat their relatives like children or household pets. And for a while, society accepted this brutal trade-off. A quiet, empty shell was preferable to a screaming, unruly burden. The Lobotomobile left a trail of these hollow men and women across the nation. A silent army of the lobotomized, visible only by the dark bruises around their eyes and the permanent vacancy in their souls. Freeman's hubris eventually became his undoing. He became reckless, prioritizing speed over safety, treating the brain less like an organ and more like an obstacle. The turning point came in Iowa. Freeman was performing a lobotomy for a photo opportunity, obsessing over the perfect camera angle, rather than the patient's life. As he turned to pose, the orbitoclast slipped deep into the patient's brainstem. The patient died on the table. It wasn't the first death, but it was the one that finally broke the spell. Hospitals began closing their doors. The era of the ice pick was ending, but not before he had hammered his legacy into the minds of nearly 3,500 people. It is comforting to paint Dr. Walter Freeman as a lone wolf, a rogue madman who tricked the world. But that is a lie we tell ourselves to sleep better at night. Freeman did not operate in the shadows, he operated in the spotlight, and the medical establishment applauded him. The New York Times hailed his work as surgery of the soul. The most prestigious universities invited him to lecture. He wasn't hidden, he was celebrated. The ultimate validation came in 1949, when Egas Moniz, the man who invented the lobotomy, was awarded the Nobel Prize in Medicine. That gold medal was a shield for Freeman. It silenced the critics and turned barbarism into gold standard science. Why did the system protect him? Because the lobotomy solved a logistical problem, not a medical one. Caring for the mentally ill was expensive. Therapy, nursing, and housing cost the state millions. A 10-minute lobotomy cost $25. It was a brutal economic calculation. It was cheaper to break a patient than to heal them. This wasn't just bad medicine, it was social engineering. Look at the demographics of the victims. Disproportionately, they were women, described as hysterical or bad housewives. They were the poor, the minorities, and the unwanted. This connects to a darker lineage in American medical history, echoing the cold utilitarianism of the Tuskegee syphilis study or the forced sterilizations of the eugenics movement. In every case, the bodies of the vulnerable were used as raw material for progress. Freeman wasn't an anomaly. He was a symptom of a medical culture that believed it had the godlike right to decide who was fit to participate in society and who needed to be pruned. The horror isn't just that one man wielded an ice pick, it's that an entire civilization handed him the hammer. Dr. Walter Freeman died in 1972. Not in a prison cell, but in a cheap hotel room, still tracing the steps of his former patients, desperately trying to prove his legacy was one of healing. He never faced criminal charges. He never apologized. To his dying breath, he believed he was a savior who had been misunderstood by a weak-willed world. The procedure was eventually banned, swept away not just by moral outrage, but by the arrival of chlorpromazine, the first antipsychotic drug. The ice pick was simply traded for the pill bottle. Today, the lobotomy is viewed as medical barbarism, a dark chapter we have firmly closed. But have we? Freeman's story forces us to confront a terrifying question. In the 1940s, the lobotomy was settled science. It was the pinnacle of progress, endorsed by the Nobel Committee. So, what standard medical practice of today will our grandchildren look back on with the same nausea Is it the way we medicate our children? The way we isolate the elderly in care homes? Or something we haven't even questioned yet? We like to think we are smarter than the people who cheered for Walter Freeman, but history suggests we are just as capable of confusing cruelty with cure. This file is now closed, but the archives are deep, and many more stories remain buried in the dark. If you want to help us bring them to the light, make sure you are subscribed. Until then, don't let the shadows fool you.